Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello, and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we talk about leadership, communication, presentation skills, and all the things you need to really get the results you need when you are making a presentation or showing up in your organization. Before I get going in the interview, I'd like to invite you to see where you could be where your presentation skills are strong by taking our free 4-minute assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And that's where you can see where your skills are strong and where perhaps a bit of support could get you the results you need and the recognition that you deserve. My guest today is Whitney Sullivan, who reached out to me and she said, do you want to talk about the mistakes you can make if you are too empathetic? And then she described a lot of things. And I thought back to my early days as a leader and realized I've made all those mistakes, and it was good to be reminded of how to set boundaries, how to manage empathy where it's useful and where it's not. And it was just a very useful conversation. Whitney's official bio is that Whitney Hinshaw Sullivan is a leadership coach and keynote speaker with a heart for beginners. With a background in leading fitness, wellness, and student leadership programs in higher education, she learned the hard way that transitioning from individual contributor to leader requires a lot more than a change of title. Whitney offers the coaching she wishes she had received so that leaders can show up with clarity, confidence, and resilience. She currently lives in Bozeman, Montana with her husband, where she's also an avid reader, outdoor adventurer, and cycling instructor. So I think you will find this a very useful conversation. On now to the interview with Whitney Hinshaw Sullivan. Whitney Sullivan, welcome to Speakers Who Get Results.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, well, and I have to applaud you because you are one of the few people speakers who wrote to me. And first of all, you said you've listened to the podcast. Hooray.
I did.
I was very happy about that. I was like, oh, people are listening. And then you said, I have something to say, and you put yourself forward, which was perfect. And I went, oh, I know what you're talking about. I have made all those mistakes. Let's talk about it. Before we get into the perils of empathy, let me ask you, who would be your dream interview? And by that, I mean someone who's no longer with us. Who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
This was such a good question to reflect on. And I actually had a really hard time picking one exact person, but I kept coming back to groups of people. And I love historical fiction. I love period pieces on Netflix. I love documentaries. And, the group of people I kept thinking of was women in history breaking barriers. And, a book I read last year was called The Rose Code. And it was this historical fiction book by Kate Quinn. I really recommend it. And she told the story of 3 women who were code breakers during World War II, or they worked, for the people doing the code breaking. And one of them in particular was a code breaker. And they worked in a place in England called Bletchley Park that no one knew was doing, the code breaking for breaking the German Enigma code. And, I thought, and those were the types of people I kept thinking of. And I realized what they had in common was females breaking barriers, especially in World War II. Here's women going into the workforce, doing something that's traditionally male dominated. And I would just be so curious to know their experience of showing up and serving in that way. And, especially after World War II, that's when things really started to shift for women in the workplace, and they were kind of the pioneers. And so I think I would just want to sit down with them and just say, hey, tell me your perspective. Tell me what it was like to show up into into this role every day. And, tell me of moments that you had to have a lot of courage. And then what would you say to someone else, down the road that also needs to show up to a space that they might need to have a little courage?
I love that. And one of the interesting things about this conversation is that, if you think about code breaking, women think differently. So, and certainly women communicate differently. There's a huge part of the work that I do is helping men and women actually learn how to talk to each other, because it's the same words, but it's really two different languages.
Mm-hmm.
So the male code breakers would have attacked the problem in a different way. And I suspect that the women would have seen connections that the men wouldn't have, but nobody talks about them.
Right. Absolutely. And that's why I loved that book so much. And it was just this, fictional representation of real events that, it's like, ooh, I'd love to actually get in there and hear what actually went down in those circumstances.
Cool. Wow. That sounds like fun. So I'm going to have to do some research about that. We will post links to both the novel and some explanation documentary information about this. So let me ask you, Whitney, what really struck me by the talk that you proposed was, what are the limits of empathy and where does empathy get us in trouble? And then when you started talking about it, I thought, oh yeah, my first years as a boss made all those mistakes. I made those mistakes. And so this podcast is really for female leaders. Some of us may have learned that lesson, and some of us may need to be reminded. So talk to me about empathy and boundaries and how they fit together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I would recommend to any female leader looking to, learn more about emotional intelligence, about empathy, about emotions, to look into Brené Brown's work in Atlas of the Heart, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. But she said so beautifully in her HBO series that she did on Atlas of the Heart that, empathy is not empathy without boundaries. And empathy without boundaries is enmeshment. And those are her words, not mine.
And mesh, where you get mesh.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And, she said so in such a clear, understanding way that, like, with empathy, we have to know where others end and where we begin. And so when it comes to being an empathetic leader, especially as a woman, how we know that, how we establish that is making sure that we're empathetic and we set boundaries and we establish clear expectations and we're willing to give critical feedback. And that empathy doesn't mean we don't do those three things. Empathy is how we show up to those difficult moments. It's a compassionate stance, or being really curious, or it's a skill in perspective taking. But I think something that I learned, especially as an emerging leader, and I work with emerging leaders in my leadership coaching practice, something that they learn is that we have to be empathetic and we have to set boundaries, establish clear expectations, and be willing to give critical feedback.
Yes. And one of the things that makes me think about this is that women are often trained to be codependent. Right? Lots of people are codependent, but women are trained to put others second. And
self-sacrificing. Absolutely.
Self-sacrificing. Yes. And I don't think anybody does it on purpose. I think it is society. This is the messages that we get, certainly from the stories we grew up on and all of that. So when it's good to have emotional intelligence and to put yourself in the shoes of the others. That's rule number one in my book, especially when someone is for the strategy of somebody who's trying to be visible and valued, is know your audience and use, my term is strategic empathy. It's my signature term.
That's a great term.
Where you are empathetic, you put yourself in the shoes of the people you're talking to, so you know what they're looking for, and so that you can talk to them in a way that they will understand it, instead of expecting them to think the same way you do.
Absolutely.
But to be strategic about it. And I think that's the part that people forget, is the strategic empathy is you are doing it, A, because it makes you a better person to understand where someone else is coming from, but B, to use it as a strategy so you can reach them where they are.
I love that. That's I think we need to repeat that. It's a strategy to meet someone where they are.
Yes.
That's such an excellent use of empathy as a tool in leadership and a strategy to meet people where they are. That's beautifully said.
Yeah. But then you have to lead. And that was something that took me a while to learn when I was running the opera company. I founded an opera company, and learning how to be a boss. I wish I'd had somebody to help me. So we're going to talk later about mentors, but that's the other thing was I thought I had to do everything myself. And I'm sure you go through that. How do you approach a client, a leader who believes that if they say they need help, that's weakness?
That's a really good question, Elizabeth. Yeah. So how do I approach a client that might believe if they need help, that that's a weakness? And the very first thing that I do with every client is we really take a deep dive into self-awareness, into what drives you, into what blind spots are. And I actually use an assessment. It's called the Enneagram assessment. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
Enneagram.
The Enneagram. Yep.
Yes.
So what I like about this assessment is that it's not very warm fuzzy. It'll tell you your strengths, but it will also tell you your blind spots. And, blind spots that can come up, for example, for leaders is that vulnerability is to be avoided at all costs. And it's just a big mindset shift to realize that asking for help is actually a form of strength. And, it's important to educate clients on what I like to call the vulnerability blind spot. And that's where, we'll offer people help all day long, right? And that's strength in us. But the moment that I have to ask for help, that's weakness in me. And so there is a quote by one of my role models early on in coaching. Her name is Mo Carrick. She's a really great thought leader on people leadership. And she has this beautiful quote and she says that courage and vulnerability are twins. They always go together. And so it's like having,
say that one again.
So this is Mo Carrick, and courage and vulnerability are twins. They always go together. And so, I work with clients on shifting their relationship to vulnerable moments actually being courageous moments. And we can't engineer the vulnerability out of our experiences, but we can begin to build tools that helps make courage a little more accessible and that vulnerability a little bit more manageable. And so, I might ask a client, it's really vulnerable to ask for help, right? That's the empathetic piece. It's vulnerable to ask for help. So I'm curious, what would make that feel more manageable? What would allow you to access the courage to ask for help a little bit more? And one of those things is self-awareness. For sure. But I also have noticed in new leaders, Elizabeth, that, the times I call it a compassion point. Usually by the time they're working with me, they've had that moment where they've realized, crap, like this is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. Yeah. Like leadership, leading people, building these relational skills with people is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. And I need to ask for help. So, so there's lots of things that go into supporting someone accessing that courage, but self-awareness is one. Understanding what makes you feel most vulnerable and how you can then turn that into a moment for courage. And then, have you had that point where you realize like, oh, this leadership journey is just a lot harder than I thought. So, and usually sometimes maybe a failure happened, something happened that they realized that they didn't have a choice to ask for help.
And here's another thought. A couple of things came up as you were talking about that. One is if you've ever worked in an organization and you're stuck with a micromanaging person, it's the person just above you is micromanaging you. It's probably because they haven't learned how to let go.
Yep.
If you are that person, learning how to delegate is so important. And if you don't delegate, your people will hate you.
Yay! I love that clarity. Yeah,
I've been on both sides of that. Yeah.
And delegating isn't a spur of the moment, kind of thing. It's a skill that takes empathy to learn how to use. And you have to, if you're going to delegate well, you have to set boundaries well. You have to be really good at setting clear expectations. And delegating is going to require giving people critical feedback. If something's not going the way that you wanted it to go, when you delegate, you're going to have to practice your empathy, put them in your shoes, and give the feedback that they need to succeed in that task.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about feedback and giving feedback. So, because that's so important and that's something, why is it so hard to give feedback?
I think, I don't want to speak for everyone, right? I can speak to my experience and I can speak to clients that I've worked with and, kind of pulling from their experiences. But I think sometimes when we give feedback, especially the higher stakes, the feedback, I think the more sometimes we want to try to manage or prevent emotional reactions in the other person. And we get really over focused on, especially if we need to give critical feedback, we get pretty over focused on, I don't want them to be upset. I don't want them to be mad at me. I don't want them to dislike me. I don't want them to, not approve of me. And we're using all of this anxiety in the wrong space. And one thing I like to work on with clients is, hey, what's your responsibility in this moment? Is it your responsibility to manage their emotions, which is trending towards enmeshment? Or is it your responsibility to be as clear, as kind as possible and, to give them the tools that they need to succeed and to create a safe space for them to have whatever emotional reaction that they might have, and then circle back a couple of days later and say, hey, what have you been thinking about this feedback? What can I do to support you? So I think giving critical feedback is hard, especially if you're a sensitive person. And I think, women, especially in the workplace, I don't know if you've experienced this, but I know I experienced a fear of being needy, of being too bossy, of being too demanding, of having too high of standards. Those are all fears. And I didn't want people to dislike me.
Society teaches us that girls are taught to be liked. That's the most important.
Yes. No, that's perfect. Yeah. Like we have that internal message that says like, if they don't like me, it's a failure. And, I think that that's a subtle undertone. I don't know that that's like always conscious, but when we really examine,
I think it's an unconscious thing that you just receive as a child in so many little bitty ways, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly.
Yeah. So I think that makes giving feedback hard, is that it's vulnerable, right? And this is Brene Brown's version of vulnerability. It's emotional exposure, risk, and uncertainty. And, you're putting yourself out there to be criticized, to be disliked, and you're exposing the things that you want, need, and expect in order to succeed. And so when we kind of over focus on what the reaction might be, I think that takes away from being really clear about the feedback that you need to give. And, I also just want to validate too, sometimes that feedback is hard. And that's also, that's okay to feel a little nervous and totally normal to feel a little. I was reading Michelle Obama's new book. She talked about being comfortably afraid. You know what? Just be comfortably afraid when you give feedback. That's totally normal.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, if you don't tell someone when they are not doing well, they might be kicked upstairs. They might be promoted because you want them out of your department. But promoted upstairs, and they'll make the same mistakes if nobody ever tells them.
It's a duty, and that's something that I kind of coach leaders on. Is like, what's your duty here? And that's a personal reflection I had to learn early on in my leadership days of like, it's my duty to give this feedback or make this decision about their status on the team, or to choose not to promote them. Like, that's my duty and that's my role. And part of leadership is sometimes people being upset with that, right?
Well, and also you have to be self-aware as a leader to know if you're not promoting somebody, make sure that you have a good reason. People talk to me about executive presence. They always say you don't have executive presence. And often it's an excuse not to promote you because you don't look like the person who's doing the promoting. Whether it be gender or skin color or nationality or whatever, any of the many things that you're not someone they think of as a leader because you don't look like them.
And that's not helpful feedback, is it? Right? So to tell someone that's not helpful feedback, I always think, I'm an executive presence. It's like, well, what does that mean? Or like, what do you want? What's your expectation?
Yeah. One of the things that I found is the most helpful at that point is if you are on the receiving end of that, say, can you give me some specifics? A really good phrase I heard the other day from DC Marshall and Mita Malik, who have a brilliant podcast called Brown Table Talk, which I listen to and learn a lot. I learn a lot about how to be a good ally. But they said, what does executive presence look like to you in this company, in this organization? So pin them down.
Right.
Gravitas is another. Gravitas and executive presence more or less means the same thing. Then there are some specific things that you can do to not sabotage yourself.
Totally. Well, and I'd probably be, I don't know if this is sassy or not, but asking that question, what does executive presence look like? And then if they say something like assertiveness, right? what I would want to know in that situation, well, am I going to be punished for being assertive too? Because I think women tend to have that double standard of, we want you to speak up, but not too harshly, but you can't, speak up, but don't be bossy, and so it's such a tough dynamic to navigate, especially when we're talking about something like executive presence. So if you're looking for a woman to do something, or will you actually reward me, for showing up in that way, or will I then be held to a double standard on the other side?
It is a tightrope that we walk as women, especially as powerful women. Let's talk a bit more about how to set good boundaries and how to get help setting boundaries. Since it's something that little girls are often not taught. It took me a long time to learn about boundaries. That was something I learned embarrassingly late, because I was the one who always wanted to be liked, wanted to be nice, wanted everybody to love me. And I didn't realize until embarrassingly late that it was not helping me professionally, nor was it helping the people I was leading. How can you think about boundaries if you are, say you're leading a team? Let's give ourselves some parameters here. So if you're leading a team, what are important boundaries?
I have a few things circling in my brain as we talk about this, in a general sense, if we first, before we dive into some specifics, I think it's important to define what boundaries are. And, I've read different authors. I love to read, so I'm always referencing books that I've read. But, I think boundaries are what you want, need, and expect in order to thrive in your role as a leader. And, that's some language I pulled from, her name is Nedra Tawwab. She wrote the book, Set Boundaries, Find Peace. So you need to know what you want, need, and expect in order to thrive at work. That's something that personally you need to know. Another powerful definition is from Melissa Urban in her book of Boundaries. She talks about boundaries being the limits that you need to set in order to feel safe and supported. And she is brilliant in pointing out is that boundaries are what I will do. Like boundaries are, we can't control other people, but we can set expectations and then make adjustments on what I will do in order to remain safe and supported in my workspace. So just to kind of throw out, a couple boundaries definitions from authors, I would definitely recommend following. They're both female and, both have some really great work examples of how important that is to set boundaries at work. But, when I think about a team, one of the first things I thought of, and this is based on my own experience, I'm a very relational leader. I'm a very relational person. And one of the big boundaries I had to learn to set was to make sure that I didn't blur boundaries between work and friendship, and because as a relational person, I built relationships with my employees. And we had strong connections. But as a leader, you have to know when the role comes before the relationship. And if your connection starts to blur the boundary between being a leader and being an employee, that's not a very good boundary to have. Another boundary that I think about is just what you need for your well-being. What do you want, need, and expect in order to thrive in your well-being at work? And this is all really introspective stuff, right? Yeah. And, no one can tell you exactly what that's going to be. It's something that, throughout your leadership journey, you have to have that self-awareness, that emotional intelligence of the things that I need in order to show up and operate at my highest self each and every day.
Well, and here is where working with a coach is useful. Yes, but also to have a team of allies that you can call on to talk through something.
I call it a support network.
Your support network, absolutely. So that you can just chat about something. Where do I find the boundaries for you? How do I deal with this person? So that as you are talking about it, you may find the answer coming out of your mouth without your brain being consciously engaged, because it's coming straight from your subconscious.
Absolutely. And you got to have that person asking those really good questions and rooting for you in that way.
Yes.
And I think too, some simple phrases, is something that I coach clients on, is that, we have to have some go-to phrases when it comes to setting boundaries. And, they might feel like writing with your left hand or your non-dominant hand, I should say, until you really start to integrate them in an authentic way. But some phrases that I like to throw out to clients is, things like, hey, if I'm talking to an employee that maybe I need to set a new boundary with, super simple phrase is to say, hey, Elizabeth, moving forward, what's okay with me is blank. What's not okay with me is blank. Or, hey, Elizabeth, moving forward, what works for me is XYZ. What doesn't work for me is XYZ. And so using that contrasting, using that future-oriented language, I think sometimes when you have just some phrases and words in your back pocket, when it comes time to actually set a boundary, then you have those words. But then the boundary has to be followed up with action. And it has to be an action that you can control, because boundaries aren't controlling other people. They're limits that you are owning.
Right. Well, and what happens when you are too empathetic or too friendly?
What happens when you're too empathetic or too friendly? Like I said, sometimes you can start to blur boundaries between work and friendship. And two, I think when we overuse empathy in a way where we start taking on the emotions of other people as our own, that's a recipe for burnout.
Yeah.
That's when it'll get burned out. When you're not protecting your limits, that's when you're going to start burning out. And it's really hard to show up as your best self when you're burnt out.
And as a leader, you need to be able to lead. And if you have made yourself, if they've seen you after your third tequila dancing on the table, they may not have the respect that for you, or they may feel like a peer, at which point it's safe to say, well, no, I'd rather not do that. And
that's such a great example. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So having been I remember a case where my boss was standing on the table singing. With a napkin over her head. And I never really thought of her the same way after that. Boundaries. How can we manage our own self-awareness?
How can we manage our own self-awareness?
Or recognize the limits of our self-awareness?
Well, I'm biased on this one, Elizabeth, because I'm a leadership coach.
Yes.
I think one of the best things you can do is invest in yourself and invest in tools that are going to help you grow that self-awareness. So it could be reading, it could be journaling. Next level up is attending professional development opportunities. But the single best thing, in my opinion, of course, I'm biased as leadership coach, is working with a coach, working with a mentor, working with someone who is going to ask you really awesome questions and give you that feedback in real time and really challenge your thinking and your mindset on things. And, especially coaches and mentors, they have tools, that they've been trained on or that they are committed to using that will help you build that self-awareness. And so I've talked about the Enneagram assessment, it's just a self-awareness assessment. We need language in order to process things. And so when it comes to self-awareness, just that constant pursuit of more and more language to help you understand, your thinking, feeling, and behavioral patterns will help grow your self-awareness. So I can't say enough that working with a coach or a mentor is just really powerful as you build your leadership practice.
Well, and also I keep thinking about surround yourself with people who are strong in the places where you are weak.
Amen.
Or not even weak, or where you're just not terribly good at that part. I'm really, I just think just an obvious practical example is I have empowered my team. I've asked my team to challenge me and to make me think about decisions, because the way my brain works, I usually find that the version 3 or 4 is the one that we're going to go with.
Totally.
I can make a snap decision, but it's often not the best one. And I'm better off if I sleep on it and think about it. So I always make sure that my team says, are you sure? Do you really want to do that, Elizabeth?
Right.
And if so, what specifically do you want to do? Because otherwise, I'll go off in 5 different directions.
Right.
And, I am easily distracted as a leader. And I've learned to surround myself with the people who are better than I am.
Absolutely. That support network is so important. And, and that's a key tenet of the program that I run for leaders, is the connection piece and asking them, who is in your support network, and making sure it's diverse. You want people who are going to cheerlead you, but who are those people that you trust to critique you too?
Yeah, they can challenge you.
Some of my favorite connections that I still value so much, were those connections that I could go to and completely trust to say, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? And they are just like, Whitney, that's crap. Whitney, you're completely off base here, and those were the most valuable connections, but we had that trust too, right? Yeah. But you have to include critics in your support network as well, ones that you trust.
Brings me back to blind spots. One of my favorite thinkers is Tina Greenbaum of Mastery Under Pressure. And she said, don't you want to know your own blind spots? Because everybody else can see them.
Absolutely.
And,
Absolutely.
And that's actually a quotable quote that I put up on social media from time to time, because I need to be reminded.
Well, and I would also add to that, Elizabeth, that if you are a leader that tends to trend towards overusing empathy, the more important it is to have a connection that you trust, that is going to be a little bit more analytical. Maybe. And one of my favorite colleagues was in higher education. She just had a very analytical approach, was just, less emotional or relational in her approach. And I could just trust her to be like, Whitney, you're being too nice.
So if any of this speaks to you, dear listener, Whitney, where could we start? What is one thing we could do if we've been listening to this saying, oh, me, they're talking about me. What's one thing you can do to start?
Stop overusing empathy.
Yeah. To start to be a better leader.
Yeah. I would say that if I could go back to my younger self, as someone who is struggling to overuse empathy, one thing I would say is, start practicing when the stakes are low, because I think how we view success and failure sometimes is not always accurate, that we think success is this one big moment and failure is one big moment, but really they're collections of a lot of small moments. And so I have a hunch that there's a lot of small, lower stakes moments that you're overusing empathy, where you're taking empathy too far, that you could practice on. And, I encourage clients, even as something as simple as if your Starbucks drink is made wrong, I want you to go ask to get it made right. It's like those small moments. If the food is bad at the restaurant, are you going to send it back and ask for something different? And the clients usually kind of gawk at that, like, what? And I'm like, no, but really, because when we practice in these small moments and we start to kind of, get a sense of what that feels like, what words are authentic for us to use, what that power feels right to get the Starbucks drink right that you paid $5 for, that eventually builds up and translates into bigger moments. And so if you can, set expectations and be empathetic in your stance in small moments, you can do it in big moments too.
Thank you, Whitney Sullivan. This has been so useful and so helpful in bringing up some of the painful memories of the mistakes I've made. And
we're all human. Yeah,
we're all human. And that there are things you can do to be a better leader, to use empathy strategically.
I love that.
And set boundaries. So thank you so much for being a guest on Speakers Who Get Results. As you're listening, if you enjoyed this, please rate us on Apple Podcasts. That's the one that matters. Give us a good review. Give us a 5-star rating. Tell your friends. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. There's lots more about leadership. And if you've got any questions, you can contact either me or Whitney Sullivan. The information will be in the show notes. And I will see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.